The global tech war just exploded. In a shocking move, China has ordered all its companies to stop buying U.S. chips immediately, delivering a massive blow to America's semiconductor industry. For years, U.S. chipmakers like Intel, Nvidia, and Qualcomm supplied the backbone of China's tech sector, from smartphones to artificial intelligence. But with one sudden order, Beijing has cut off billions in revenue, sending shockwaves through Wall Street and Silicon Valley. This isn't just another trade dispute. Analysts warn it could mark the beginning of a full-scale tech decoupling between the world's two largest economies. And with AI, 5G, and quantum computing on the line, the stakes have never been higher. China has just delivered a thunderous blow to the global technology landscape. In an emergency directive, Beijing ordered all state-owned enterprises and private companies to immediately halt purchases of U.S. semiconductors. The announcement came late last night from China's Ministry of Commerce, citing national security concerns and accusing Washington of weaponizing technology exports. This order hits some of America's biggest tech giants directly in the gut. Companies like Intel, Nvidia, Qualcomm, and Micron, which depend heavily on the Chinese market, saw their stocks plunge within hours of the announcement. Wall Street analysts estimate the ban could wipe out tens of billions in revenue from U.S. semiconductor firms over the next year alone. The move is widely seen as retaliation for Washington's recent restrictions on Chinese tech giants, including bans on exporting advanced chips and manufacturing equipment to companies like Huawei and SMIC. Beijing's decision to cut off U.S. chip suppliers completely marks a new phase in the U.S. China tech war, one that threatens to reshape global supply chains for years to come. The shockwaves are already spreading far beyond Wall Street. American chipmakers, long considered world leaders in semiconductor innovation, now face the prospect of losing access to one of their largest markets overnight. Meanwhile, Chinese tech firms are expected to accelerate their push toward homegrown semiconductor solutions, investing billions in domestic production and partnerships with non-U.S. suppliers in places like Taiwan, South Korea, and Europe. What began as a trade dispute has now escalated into an all-out technological confrontation, and experts warn the consequences for the global economy could be enormous. The U.S. China tech war didn't start overnight. It has been building for years, fueled by growing rivalry over trade, national security, and technological dominance. Semiconductors, often called the brains behind modern electronics, quickly became the centerpiece of this conflict. These chips power everything from smartphones and cars to artificial intelligence and advanced weaponry, making them one of the most strategic industries on the planet. Tensions first erupted in 2018 when Washington imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, accusing Beijing of intellectual property theft and unfair trade practices. China retaliated with its own tariffs, but the fight soon moved beyond steel and soybeans into high-tech territory. Under the Trump administration, the U.S. began restricting Chinese access to advanced American semiconductors and the tools needed to manufacture them. Companies like Huawei and SMIC, China's leading telecom and chip firms, found themselves blacklisted, unable to buy critical U.S. technologies. Washington argued these steps were necessary to protect national security and prevent China from dominating emerging fields like 5G, AI, and quantum computing. Beijing, in response, launched massive investments to develop its own semiconductor industry, pouring tens of billions into domestic chip-making projects. Still, until now, China continued importing huge volumes of U.S. chips for its factories, data centers, and consumer tech products. That fragile balance shattered with this latest boycott order, pushing the tech war into uncharted territory and raising fears of a permanent technological decoupling between the world's two largest economies. The economic shockwaves from China's chip boycott were immediate and severe. On Wall Street, shares of major U.S. semiconductor companies plunged within hours of the announcement. Nvidia, Intel, and Qualcomm, three giants with deep ties to the Chinese market, each lost billions in market value overnight. Analysts estimate that U.S. chipmakers collectively face tens of billions in lost revenue if the boycott holds, potentially leading to production cuts, layoffs, and reduced spending on research and development. For Silicon Valley, this is nothing short of a nightmare scenario. China accounts for nearly one-third of global semiconductor demand, and American companies have long relied on Chinese tech firms as some of their biggest customers. Losing access to that market not only hurts profits but also risks undermining U.S. leadership in critical sectors like artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and defense technologies. Politically, the boycott has set off alarms in Washington. Lawmakers from both parties are calling for emergency measures to protect U.S. chipmakers, with some demanding new subsidies to ramp up domestic production under the CHIPS and Science Act. At the same time, hawks in Congress are urging even tougher export controls on Chinese tech companies, warning that Beijing's move proves it cannot be trusted as a trade partner. Globally, investors fear this tit-for-tat escalation could fracture the semiconductor supply chain, driving prices higher and slowing innovation across industries from smartphones to electric vehicles. The global reaction to China's chip boycott has been swift and divided. In Europe, officials expressed concern that rising U.S. China tensions could disrupt already fragile technology supply chains. The European Union, which relies heavily on both U.S. semiconductor technology and Chinese manufacturing demand, warned that a prolonged standoff might force companies to rethink where they source chips and where they sell them. South Korea and Taiwan, home to semiconductor giants like Samsung and TSMC, are watching closely. On one hand, the boycott could open the door for them to expand market share in China, replacing U.S. suppliers. On the other hand, these companies face enormous pressure from Washington to align with U.S. export restrictions, leaving them caught in the middle of a rapidly escalating tech war. In Japan, chip equipment manufacturers like Tokyo Electron are evaluating how the crisis might impact sales to both U.S. and Chinese customers. Meanwhile, India, eager to become a new semiconductor hub, is courting American and European companies looking to diversify away from both China and Taiwan. Global markets are already reacting. Semiconductor supply chains, which span dozens of countries, are under immense strain as companies scramble to reroute production and secure alternative suppliers. Industry analysts warn this boycott could accelerate the push for regionalized chip ecosystems, where the U.S., China, and allies build separate, competing technology networks. For now, uncertainty dominates as every major tech economy braces for ripple effects from the world's two largest powers clashing over the future of semiconductors. The future of the U.S.-China tech war now looks more uncertain and more dangerous than ever. With Beijing cutting off U.S. chipmakers and Washington weighing retaliatory measures, analysts warn this standoff could spiral into a full-scale technological decoupling between the world's two largest economies. U.S. lawmakers are already pushing for expanded export bans on advanced semiconductor tools, AI chips, and quantum computing technology, aiming to choke off China's access to critical innovations. Beijing, meanwhile, is expected to accelerate its push for self-sufficiency in semiconductors, pouring billions into domestic chip manufacturing and forging deeper partnerships with suppliers in South Korea, Taiwan, and even Russia. If this escalation continues, the global semiconductor industry could fracture into two separate ecosystems, one led by the U.S. and its allies, the other dominated by China and countries aligned with its trade policies. Such a split would disrupt decades of globalization, driving up production costs, slowing technological progress, and fueling geopolitical instability. Economists also warn of ripple effects beyond technology. Industries like automotive, aerospace, and telecommunications, all dependent on advanced semiconductors, could face soaring costs and supply shortages. Meanwhile, global investors fear a prolonged tech war might trigger financial market volatility, especially if China retaliates by targeting other U.S. industries. For now, both sides appear unwilling to back down, raising the risk that the semiconductor showdown becomes the defining economic conflict of the 21st century. The U.S.-China tech war has now reached a breaking point. With Beijing cutting off American chipmakers and Washington weighing its next move, the future of global technology hangs in the balance. Will this lead to two rival tech ecosystems, rising costs, and slower innovation? Or will cooler heads eventually find common ground before the damage becomes permanent? One thing is clear, the semiconductor industry, the backbone of modern life, has become the front line of economic warfare. For more updates on the U.S.-China tech war, global markets, and the future of technology, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring you the latest analysis on the world's most important stories.